Thanks so much, Anoop. And I'll introduce you guys in a second. Let's make sure I can share my slides and make sure that works out. But a super big thanks to the Elevate team. That was a fantastic, fascinating, complex or a deconstruction of a very complex challenge that's really fundamental in sustainability. And we're really appreciative of sharing all of that wisdom and experience and all the fantastic work they do. So, as you said, Anoop, this is our 17. It's been a very long day, but this will be my last contribution to the webathon tonight. So I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues Anoop and Victoria. Do you want to say a quick hello, Anoop? Again, just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone again. So I'm Anoop. I'm based in India, looking after GlobeScan's operations here. So very excited to present you certain insights from the global study that we've done and some peculiarities of the market here.
Excellent, thanks, Anoop. And Victoria, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself a little bit too?
Yep, I'm Victoria. So I am Director for Asia Pacific. So based in Hong Kong, we cover the very varied Asia Pacific market. Today we're going to be focusing mainly on the China market, but our global study covers lots of elements, and so we'll delve into some of that as we go.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Anoop. And we will have a chat. I mean, I'll lead through a conversation on our research, but we'll talk about a few important subjects related to how consumers are responding to the sustainability agenda. And given the 3 companies we want to focus on in the context of 30 other countries, we really wanted to pick out the 3 biggest emitters, the 3 largest countries by population, those being China, India, and the United States. And we'll focus on climate issues, attitudinal perspectives on the sustainability agenda, sort of the types of behaviors that are shifting and changing among people in those countries and others, and then what are the barriers and solutions to unlocking more sustainability responses and healthy and sustainable living. If we have time in the hour, we'll also dive into a really interesting nugget that we've identified around diversity and sustainability that has good connectivity to the just transition conversation as well. So let me just describe the research we're doing. So at GlobeScan, we're an insights and strategy firm. We do lots of work related to the nexus of trust, reputation, brand, purpose, and also sustainability. And one of the things that we're doing an increasing amount of work on is the demand side of the agenda. And that involves understanding more deeply what consumers are thinking, what they're feeling, how they're acting, and how they're, again, responding to some of the sustainability concerns, issues, corporate plays, regulatory regimes, all that kind of stuff. And we've done a lot of that work over the decades, but in honesty, it wasn't always as precise or as targeted as it could or should have been. So 4 years ago, we decided to work together with a bunch of brands and NGOs and academics to better together figure out how do we understand the shifting context within which we're operating as businesses and as NGOs, and how are consumers shifting and changing their behavior and their attitudes, and how do we get better at really understanding how do we mobilize and move and engage consumers more effectively on sustainability. So we've got a number of brands like CVS Health and IKEA and Levi Strauss and PepsiCo and Reckitt and Visa, but also NGOs like WWF and the Acatu Institute of Brazil and the Stern School, the Center for Sustainable Business in New York. And so together we're cracking through, I think, a little bit more effectively of where things are going and trying to understand this very last mile of the sustainable development journey. So we wanted to share with you some of the findings from our 2021 study and look in some depth between different countries and different parts of the regions, but with a particular focus on those 3 really big emitter countries and biggest population countries being China, India, and the United States. Here's our methodology. We do an online survey now, and we've been calibrating it to census data as close as possible. And it's a large survey. There's over 30,000 interviews that take place across over 30 markets. And you can see in the Asian region, we're covering North, South, East Asia quite effectively. There's always some countries that are missing, but we've got a good range of countries included, and we'll try and point those out as we go through, even with a special focus on the US, China, and India. So let's talk about climate concern first of all, and Anup and Victoria just jump in anytime, and I'll pause here and there, but to add a sense of what's transpiring. But we've asked this question last year to people across all 31 markets that were involved, and we said, how serious are these different kinds of issues? And this chart is showing the aggregation of the 30,000 interviews and the percentage of people who say this is a very serious issue. So you can see 66% of people across the world last July said the pandemic and COVID-19 is a very serious issue. Just a smidge, just a little bit below that, we have 64% of the global population saying climate change is also a very serious issue. And a little titch below that, 63% saying depletion of natural resources is a very serious issue, and water pollution. And so you can see the juggling and the clustering of all these issues, including the pandemic and these environmental issues at the very highest level of concern in many ways. And if we look at the trend in these three countries over the last 6 years in particular, since the Paris Agreement took place, we can see a steady shift in some of these countries, particularly in India. A couple of years ago, we have now 92% of people in India saying climate is either very or somewhat serious as an issue. An extraordinary number. China, it's been a bit more consistent over time, but we have 86% of people in China saying this is a big deal. And the US trails both Indian and Chinese concerns on climate, but you can see the extraordinary shift that's transpired since 2015, where we have almost close to 20% of the population increasingly concerned about climate compared to 6 years ago. So a monumental shift and change. And in many ways, American public opinion on climate has caught up to the rest of the world. So just a quick comment from you, Victoria, first on and your sense of, does this conform, and why would Chinese people be as concerned about climate for this long? In many ways, I think we're still stuck in a North versus South or East versus West paradigm, and people are surprised that people in other parts of the world outside of Europe and North America are concerned about these issues. But what's your take on what's happening in China?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that people in general are concerned, and I think this shows it. I think the surprising thing here that you pointed out is that in 2015, the US seemed to be so far, well, let's say behind, but of a different opinion, perhaps. I think that's something that you wouldn't expect. I think the fact that they're now getting much closer together is reflective of what's happening now. I think climate change has become a concern globally. I think everywhere around the world, it might be viewed slightly differently, but I do think that the governmental commitments to achieving a net zero future also play a role. So I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see it creep up a little bit more. I know that we're going to run this study again this year, so it'll be very interesting to see how that little, what should we call it? It's not quite conflict, but how the top grouping plays out. Is COVID going to continue to be very, very serious? I think in China, yes. Maybe the rest of the world will see it drop down. But climate change, I think, everywhere is getting more and more higher on the agenda, not just for governments, but also for businesses. We're seeing pledges left, right, and centre, and nobody's being left out of it. So I do think that we'll see that inch upwards. The interesting thing will then be, and we'll have another graph to show this at some point in time, is what are we doing about it? So these people are concerned in the high 80s and high 90% percentile. Are we actually matching that with action? Remains to be seen.
Fantastic, and it's very aligned with the government policy in many ways, and the focus of climate being part of the national agenda and the legitimate discussion and discourse in China. Anup, in India, it's a higher level of concern, and perhaps doesn't have the same governmental consistency as China does. But so what do you think is happening here, and why are Indians so concerned about climate change?
I think one of the key reasons, Chris, is the frequency of extreme weather-related events have like only increased in the last 5 to 8 years. So we've slowly moved from act of God to like thinking maybe, oh, this could actually be an act of man. So climate change, there's a lot of focus, emphasis, and awareness creation, let's say by even the NGO sector, on why we need to like really start working towards it. And while government interventions have probably not been as significant as China, but there's always a lot of buzz around whenever we go to the end of year COP 25, 26, 24, where India has usually been that face who's fought for climate justice and who's trying to understand and create a lot of noise on why we need like an equitable future in terms of addressing climate mitigation or climate change. So it's really stirred at least a large portion of the country to like take notice of what's happening. And hopefully this concern will only increase because we've had like massive heat waves or like very cold winters, severe rainfalls, and I'm sure it's not going to be the end that we see. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Anup. Yeah, there's terrible stories of extreme weather events everywhere, but yeah, India's had its more than fair share, perhaps, of some of those. And this speaks to that, I think, a little bit where both Victoria and Anup were speaking about, where we've asked this separate question that is less esoteric, less sort of high level, and much more personal, and asking how much have you personally been affected by each of these issues. And we can see a gap now between the pandemic and climate change, so it sort of makes sense. But we still see 36% of the global population saying that they've been greatly personally affected by climate change, and that's up 5 points in a year. So that's a significant shift in the course of a year. And if we look at the 3 countries here, and the differences where personal impact, and as Anup was just talking, that there's an extraordinary gap between how Indians are saying they've been personally greatly affected by climate compared to Americans or Chinese, and American and China essentially the same, 1 in 4 in those two countries are feeling great personal impact, both moving in a similar direction, but in India towers over them when it comes to the numbers and the populations that are affected. Any further comments on this, Anup?
Yeah, also while India and China have like similar population, India is a much more denser country. So any phenomena will have like much more impact than let's say some of the Chinese cities. So that's why I think the proportion of people who really feel they've been personally affected is generally going to be very high. And it's going to be the other way as well. So whenever we feel things are getting better, a large number of people will say things are getting better. So there's going to be like a huge spike whenever we look at India.
Interesting. That's great. And just to extend it, this same sort of trend of an increasing sense that people are being personally impacted by climate change, the trend is up in almost every single market. And there are differences by countries that are quite dramatic. So we saw India sort of at the 41%. So to the left of India, there are other countries like Colombia and Turkey and Mexico that are where you have populations like saying that they're experiencing even greater levels of personal impact from climate change, and all the way to the right, like the Netherlands, which has been dealing with extreme weather or challenging conditions for centuries with many dams and canals and adaptations. And it doesn't mean that they're not concerned about climate change as a population. They certainly are, but we know that when things get personal, that's where there's a different set of behaviors and expectations from governments and from businesses and others in society. Great. And to continue the theme, we asked this question last year as well, getting a sense of, do people understand and think of these extreme weather events? Are they highly unusual and alarming? Are people freaked out? That's the red bar. Are they viewing it as kind of unusual and maybe a little worrisome, and that's the orange bar? And then there's those who believe that it's really part of a natural pattern, or a very few percentages that don't believe it's happening at all. So that's interesting. Even in the US, we have 1% of the population saying this is climate change, extreme weather really isn't happening. So that's interesting. But in the US, you do have the highest segment of 36% of the population that still believe this is part of a natural phenomenon rather than a human-made phenomenon. And in that country, there's been a huge politicization of the agenda, as we know. So it's worked in polarizing society in many capacities. Interestingly, the Chinese aren't as freaked out as the Americans or Indians proportionally. And Victoria, I don't know if you have any thoughts on why that would be. What's the Zen calmness of what's transpiring in China relative to these countries on climate?
Well, I wish I could explain it per person. I think in general, I think you just mentioned in the US, it's become highly politicized. I think a big thing is, we just mentioned the Chinese government have put, a big emphasis on striving towards a more sustainable future. And so I think maybe there is some hope involved in that, slightly worrisome, as opposed to complete freak out. It's alarming. I think in relation to what Anup said, maybe the proportion of people that are directly impacted, China has also had more than its fair share of extreme weather events just this year alone, and when we're only halfway through it. But I think, again, because it's such a big place, because they are, it happens here, it doesn't affect you over there, that whole thing of if you can't see it, you don't feel it. I think there's a little bit of that, being such a large country. And then I think there might be something to say, and I'm no expert on this, but there might be something around education and understanding. So I think, again, we go back to what people understand about climate change. I think over the years, people are understanding more and more. Scientists are understanding more. That's becoming more mainstream. But is there still that underlying feeling of not really knowing? And therefore, the less you know, the less worried you get. I know from my personal perspective, the more news I read, the more anxious I become. And that's definitely a trend from the last 2 to 3 years, not ever before. And I think that's because there's more and more information in the public domain. So one or all of those reasons might be contributing here.
It's great points. And yeah, sometimes the less we know, the better we feel in the short term.
Yeah, it doesn't help necessarily long term, but in the minute, it does.
So totally. And just to reference, because you talked about our next survey, which is going into field imminently, like maybe next week or in a couple of weeks, we are going to ask some of these questions, but we're also asking for the first time, what kind of impact have people had from climate? Has it been experiencing floods? Is it wildfires? Is it extreme weather events? Is it drought? And that'll be really interesting to see the different types of extreme weathers and how that impacts people's perceptions on the broader sustainability agenda. And you can see this little trend between 2015 and 2021. So Paris and Glasgow benchmarks in many ways. And in all 3 countries, there's a direction towards a sense that this is the freakout meter has gone up across all 3 countries. In particular, India, and Anup explained why, I think, with the number in the last 5 years of dramatic and more magnified extreme weather events, but the trend is clear across all three greenhouse gas large emitters. And what's also interesting in line with this is that there is even support for raising taxes on different types of energy. And especially in China with 83%, and that's up 6 points from 6 years ago, but also India, where there's even perhaps a higher reliance on coal or fossil fuels in the future going forward comparatively, although China does, I think, use 54% of global coal production, or burns 54% of global coal for fossil fuel and energy. So both big emitters and users still of oil and fossil fuels. And the Americans, a remarkable shift of 17-point increase in the last 6 years in favoring raising taxes and essentially putting a carbon tax on these issues. So that there's some really interesting trends in these 3 biggest emitters. I think it did contribute to a positive outcome or relatively positive outcome out of COP26 in Glasgow? Because public opinion does matter in all these countries, irrespective of the governance mechanisms there. So there's an interesting trend that way. I don't know if either of you have comments on the notion of a carbon tax or a price on pollution in these countries.
I think, Chris, one of the direct impacts of the war on Ukraine has been the reliance on coal. So there's been a shortage of coal in India in terms of create for the power. I mean, it's been exacerbated by the heat wave. People generally wanting to use air conditioners all day long. So there's like a shortage of power throughout the country, and we're having to import coal from outside to rely and to meet that demand. And this, I think, it's happening across many parts of East Asia as well. So we've unfortunately, COVID and this war has like pushed the agenda of like reaching peak coal like few more years away. I mean, we were maybe trying to get to that point where I think China committed to 2060, if I'm not wrong. India also committed to a year saying that we will peak coal then and we will stop doing it. But now the current situation, it's gonna take a few more years to like come back and be gung-ho about having such a very clear projection. So we did have in India a few schemes called Perform, Achieve and Trade, where there was an incentive given to corporates to like cut down on their emissions, scope 1 emissions, which are related to coal as well. So it'll be, I think, a few more years till we get back again to having that focus.
And India feels like one of those countries where the conversation on the just transition is especially poignant and relevant because of the development trajectory, because of the still significant amounts of poverty in the country and the pre industrialization in parts of the economy and the impact of historical climate change gases really being emitted by North America and Europe over time. And yet there's a very strong projection of use of more greenhouse gases. So it's a complex issue. Is the just transition, from both your perspectives, something that is talked about? Is language like that used in India or China?
I think it depends what circles you're talking in. I mean, we are in sort of sustainability focused circles, often talking with lots of global companies. And I think, yes, that's where this language, this sort of rhetoric is very front of mind. I think climate change in general, carbon in general, those notions are known, but I think that the language isn't necessarily there yet. I think it might be being looked at in a slightly different way.
Like rightly said, I mean, the banking and investor sector, I think, are now looking at this because they are at risk as well in terms of their assets being stranded. So the just transition dialogue is being pushed from there. But on one hand, there is like focus on increasing dependence on renewable energy, but it may not necessarily be directly linked to the just transition. I mean, they're just trying to mitigate their risk of dependence on coal or even crude oil. So yeah, I think it's there, but maybe not directly linked to just transition.
So that's great. Thank you both. And we do get a sense that there's different levels of empowerment. We asked this attitudinal question. Climate change is such a big problem that there's very little the individual can do. And this shows the proportion of people who disagree with that statement. So you can see in China compared to India, the difference where Chinese are much more bullish and feeling more empowered, and India less so, and Americans are kind of in between on that level of self-empowerment on this very complex issue. And then what we also see this really consistent trend across these three very different countries between 2015 and 2021, where there's a growing sense that, yeah, large companies have a responsibility to encourage governments to do more on climate change. Sort of an advocacy and public policy play for business, and the public is increasingly supporting that to over 9 in 10 in both India and China, and nearly 8 in 10 in the US. So it's phenomenal how this convergence on this issue is coming along, not just from a sense of concern, but also a sense of the expectation or the role of business in trying to advocate for stronger policies around the agenda. So let's just summarize briefly on the climate change section. We've seen this rise in concern across the three countries. We've seen this personal impact growing. There's are some variations on certain issues around how urgent or how dramatic or how freaked out we should be, but those will change over time with extreme weather events. And we're also seeing that there's this, relatively strong and surprisingly increasing strong support for both carbon taxes and for corporate roles to play in advocating for better public policy on climate change. So all those things were in play leading into Glasgow, which again I think has contributed to all this. Any last thoughts before we move on to the next section from either you, Victoria or Anoop?
I think for me, just to say, oh, sorry, Anoop.
Go on.
I was just going to say, despite the differences in the countries of whatever it is, demographics, culture, finances, level of development, etc., I think it's very interesting that they are actually all showing this similar trend. In general, there was only one or two charts that we saw there that where they were different. I think in general, climate concern as a topic as a whole is on the increase, and like we just said, that there's more expectation of business, there's more expectation of government, and I think that's something that is consistent across these three huge economies, which definitely says something about the way in which people are currently thinking about their futures.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to say that it'll be really interesting to see this year's trends and results of the survey, because I feel the concern will only increase further with like maybe in many countries COVID kind of easing. So it'll be primarily, let's see what will be like the concern of the people.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see, and especially in the context, I think, of we had COVID, obviously, naturally, for people to deal with. Now we've got dramatic inflation and cost of living increases, and we have a war in Ukraine and geopolitical instability at a level we haven't seen for a long, many decades. So all of these things will be interesting to see how they influence the public perception and support for the climate agenda. But I think from a governance perspective, it is remarkable. These three biggest emitters have similar trajectories, similar experiences, and attitudes towards climate change, and that bodes well for a global governance structure, because it's really hard to get 195 countries to agree. We've got the three biggest ones at the table in a similar vein, with very different trajectories. That's positive. Okay, let's shift to attitudinal shifts, and this is fascinating again through the pandemic, how people are beginning to change their perceptions to the broader sustainability and consumption agenda as consumers. And you can see across the world, across the 30 countries again, we're seeing an increasing view that we got to change how we consume, and people saying, I think we need to consume less to preserve the environment for future generations. That's up 7 points between before the pandemic and then kind of halfway through the pandemic. We also see a sense of personal thirst for wanting to find ways to reduce our own footprints. And that's grown over the last couple of years. There's an indicative view that people want to pay more or want to frequent brands that are working to improve society and the environment. It's not necessarily translates to market share, but again, it's a direction where there's an opportunity for brands to play a role. There's also a significant 9-point increase in people feeling guilty about their impact on the environment, and in some ways that's especially expressed by people in Sweden who there's a term around flight guilt that's been used and part of a natural vocabulary now there. This really interesting trend where people are increasingly believing by 9 points over 2 years of what's good for me, the things that I want, that I desire, are inherently not good for the environment. So there's a trade-off that people are increasingly feeling. So all of these are natural opportunities for brands to play a role in helping reduce the friction, reduce the tension, demonstrate that their service, their product, their approach actually is more sustainable and can do things like change the way we consume to help people be empowered to reduce their own footprints and have people feel good about that and reduce their negative impacts in many ways. And on some of these issues, we'll just go through them very quickly, and then we'll pause and see what your thoughts are. We're seeing high levels and kind of increasing levels, especially in China and the US, on this issue of needing to consume differently. And while we maybe would expect that India, a country with lower levels of consumption overall, wouldn't be this high, but still 3 in 4 Indians believe that we've got to change how we as society consume to preserve the environment. So that's a remarkable finding, and even higher than in the US, where we know there's lots of overconsumption on a per capita basis compared to other parts of the world. When it comes to this attitudinal question of wanting to reduce our own impact, that, how do we get empowered to do that? There's high levels between India and China, exactly the same today, and both increased over 10 points in the past couple of years. And in the US, a 9-point increase, where there's also an increasing sense of urgency and also appeal to try and live differently and live better in many ways. So that's interesting. And this other consistent, this is what blows, I think, our mind, the consistency of the trend, despite the difference between the absolute values of people increasingly feeling guilty about their impacts on the environment. And that's creeped up in India, it's gone up a little more in China, and it's grown dramatically by 15 points in the United States between 2019 and 2021. And on the willingness to pay, this also is in the same direction, and especially dramatic increases in the US again, which have really moved. But in China, we have a 12-point increase in people wanting to support or buy from brands that are more sustainable or purposeful. And then finally, this really interesting thing about what's good for me is not good for the environment. Here's where we finally have some divergence in trends, where in India, we've got a dramatic increase in Indians saying, yeah, I am, this deep internal tension about feeling guilty about the environment, what's good for me isn't good for others. In the US, a different level there as well, on a 15-point increase. So any surprises or thoughts there? And maybe you start with you, Victoria, and then go to Anoop, but any comments or perspectives on these attitudinal trends?
For me, it's the we need to consume less one. And the fact that everybody feels like we need to consume less. But when I think about the way life is lived at the moment in China, I mean, you think about these huge platforms like Taobao, you can get anything delivered anytime, any minute. I mean, this goes worldwide, but China has some of the biggest platforms to be able to do this, and life really has shifted online. The pandemic has accelerated it even further. The ongoing lockdowns have made it even more so. So I see this, there must be a gap between this thing of people saying, I believe we need to consume less, but I feel like, unfortunately, we might not be going in that direction. So believing is one thing, feeling guilty is, I guess, it's the next step, maybe. I don't know if feeling guilty is a productive next step, but actually how, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier about expectation on business, how are businesses, suppliers, governments, etc., allowing people to live in a way where maybe they can start to consume less, whether they can foresee, okay, well, if I do X, that will lead to Y, rather than like, oh, well, I'll just pick up my phone and order this because I need it now. Yeah. And I can get it now. So I feel like what people are saying, it's not that I don't believe it, but I think what we're seeing in reality is everybody has been enabled to consume at a pace that we've never seen before, with an ease we've never seen before. So how does that, and I'm sure there's a technological solution to this, I just don't know it, how does that and the feeling and the belief that we need to consume less go hand in hand?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that empowerment and the remarkable shift in e-commerce and the distribution of it is extraordinary. I guess what the data shows is there's an opportunity to disrupt that if we can find the way to do it with that similar or slightly different approaches to consumption, but in ways that are much more clearly sustainable. And I think that's the holy grail. But Anup, any comments on the attitudinal elements you've seen here?
Yeah, I think just to set a context, as a society in India, we've been like very focused on reuse, focus on repair and all of it. So we've like learned to live with very few resources. But what's happened in the last 10, 15 years is this whole burst of consumerism, India starting to ape some of the culture from the West, like fast fashion, that we've got Amazon here. So it's kind of exploded really. So what the pandemic did was to again go back and have like a correction where people started thinking, okay, do I actually need these many clothes? Do I actually have to travel every day, get stuck in traffic for 2 hours? Like there's been like a cultural shift that this pandemic has really kind of helped people get into. So they're like cooking at home, or they're not maybe going out that often. So in terms of their consumption, so it's not surprising at all to look at people saying that they are now feeling very guilty of their behavior, of their attitude towards the environment. So I just hope it can sustain, because now things opening up, we really don't know if people will get back to their old habits. But it's really heartening to see it shift to come back from this extravagance to like more contained consumerism.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and what you're talking about, the reuse and recycling and rethinking consumption patterns, probably out of some necessity historically, that this is now we're picking up in the US, but also parts of Europe too, where young people, Gen Zers in particular, are quite keen on finding brands that commit to the circularity in many ways. So, kind of like an older school circularity being brought in by younger generations, but it's also been around for a long time in many parts of the world as a natural, thoughtful approach to, conserve resources. Okay, great. So let's look at some behavior change elements. And what's really interesting is we've seen this very consistent pattern across the world of how people, in the amount that they want to change their lifestyle when it comes to living healthy and well, and also when it comes to having an environmentally friendly lifestyle. And the gap between that and the actual actions people are taking to make some major changes in their lives. So on the environmentally friendly side, we'll stick with that. 46% of people across the world are saying, yeah, I really want to change my lifestyle a great deal when it comes to my impact on the environment. And yet only 22% of people across the world are saying they're taking major actions to do such actions. So we do have this aspiration action gap that is true across the world, and we can also see it here on the environmental side across these different countries. And so the desirability and what you were talking about, Anup, comes through loud and clear here. We have 2/3 of Indians saying, I really want to change my lifestyle a great deal. And maybe there's something interesting and special in India with the pandemic in particular that has changed those attitudes so dramatically. But also in China and the US tapers off of that level of desire. And there's an irony here, of course, given the footprints of American consumers compared to any consumers. And Chinese in the middle, and then the level of actions are also commensurate with those attitudinal desires, where Indians and Chinese are more apt to say they've taken major action on environmental issues compared to Americans. And again, this flips, I think, upside down our historical notions of sustainability and consumers, where Europe and North America are viewed much more advanced, quote unquote, but we're seeing the reality and concerns and the openness to try and make changes in dramatic ways in India and China, but also in parts of Africa and Latin America. So it really is a more complex matrix to try and understand where things are shifting. Any thoughts on this from either of you?
I think we will see some of the reasons why there's a change in aspirations in the barriers, I think, when we move forward. Because a lot of people have aspired to like make a change, but there are some aspects which are preventing them from actually taking this through.
Excellent. So we've asked in the survey a whole range of specific actions and asked how often and frequent people do these. And then we've categorized them into different buckets that statistically they stick together. So conscious consumption habits, healthy lifestyle, recycling, kind of early circularity elements, sustainable mobility, plant-based eating, all these different elements are there. And then we aggregate them and track them over time. And if we can show the gap between here, the aspiration and the action that we were talking about before, there is a gap in every single country, and it varies to degrees in different parts of the world. But you can see in developing countries a heightened level of wanting to change how we live. But then when we look at the index score across the world, there's also variability. So a high, healthy, and sustainable living index score, meaning that there's more openness and behaviors oriented towards sustainable living, are the darker countries. So China and India, much darker than the US, for instance, and much darker than other parts of the world. And then when we look at the actual mean scores across all of those 30 different behaviors that we were looking at, you can see the various levels of healthy and sustainable living, where in India it's higher than it is in China or the US, but the shift and change, the drama of the shift has been most extraordinary in all of the 30 markets in the US, where from a very low score relatively, there's been a great deal of movement in a range of different issues. And so if we look at some of those in a specific way, just to get a flavor, you can see at individual behaviors, these shifts that have transpired relatively dramatically in significant percentages. So eating locally produced food, 10 points increase over 2 years. Buying secondhand clothing items, for example, that's an 8-point increase, and especially pronounced among young people, for instance. Using your own shopping bag, that's also up 8 points. So there's this movement in American consumer culture that is trying to, again, shift and catch up to where other people are to a certain degree. We do see here, and this is maybe the shift you were talking about too, in the reconciliation of where people are at, and now they're kind of also in India a little bit on the back foot to a degree on some of these issues. That's interesting, but not too dramatic. And then when it comes to what's happening in China, we're seeing some movement on some of these issues that are important to flag. And so this volatility and the shifts at an aggregate level are relatively minuscule. They don't add up to a whole bunch. And it's kind of warm beer when we're trying to think of dramatic shifts in consumption patterns that we need to meet what science tells us has to transpire from a climate perspective, from a nature perspective, from a resource consumption perspective. So any thoughts on the behavior change element? Maybe Anup, I'll start with you if you've got any perspectives or things you want to bring in.
I think hopefully the gap between aspiration and the action that you take up will reduce as we move forward. There are like more things, like, for example, if I have like a desire to drive an EV, but there isn't enough infrastructure in a country like India to make it like very possible to do long drive. So hopefully as we start meeting such needs, the gap will really reduce.
Yeah, the demand supply equation sometimes doesn't work with consumer aspirations. And I think it's true even from a brand level in certain parts of the world, where the clarity or the opportunity to choose a certain brand over another is difficult because there's just not enough difference, and there's not enough dynamism perhaps in the branding, if not the actual performance of product and services. And Victoria, any thoughts on the behavior side?
Yeah, well, I think related to that, I think again, living in Asia and having previously lived in Europe, the supply is definitely different in terms of what you're looking for as a sustainable consumer. So if I take my sort of GlobeScan hat off and I just put my normal everyday sort of sustainably minded individual hat on, you've got to sort of look elsewhere to find those solutions. And one of the things that I think is quite positive about that is that there's a big opportunity for locally sourced, for want of a better word, solutions. So for local companies to start to address some of these challenges, not always relying on some of these global companies who have been thinking about this for much longer, that are starting to introduce things. So I think there's an opportunity there for people who do think like this to just be entrepreneurial and to start to bring local solutions to the fore. If people want it, then you would hope that they will buy it or consume it or whatever. And then I think the other thing is just to comment on the USA sort of China-India piece, to touch on what Anup said before. Culturally in India, there's been a history of sort of like repairing and upcycling and that kind of thing. I think also from my time spent in China anyway, it's easy to ride a bike. It's easy to buy locally because there are fresh farmers markets everywhere you go. So I think some of those sustainable behaviors are actually already entrenched, and it's about putting more emphasis on them rather than saying, let's do things differently because we're getting more modern or we're getting more westernized or whatever, but actually saying some of what we have is great already, and it can actually contribute to having a more sustainable lifestyle by just engaging with it.
That local expression of what is sustainable is really interesting, and something that we need to, I think, at GlobeScan and dig into a bit further too. Okay, so let's push forward. The barriers and solutions is a critical piece of the puzzle, because we do have that aspiration action gap, and it's been around for a while. It'll probably be around forever, but our job collectively is how do we unlock that a little bit and bring it down. And so we've asked this simple question, which is, I think, quite revealing. And the more we think about it, the more potent it is. But we ask people to identify different potential barriers that are stopping or preventing them from living in healthier and sustainable ways. And across the world, the rank order you can see here, where 47% of people across the world say not enough government support. A very similar number say it's just too expensive to live sustainably. And then 1 in 3 also point out to not enough business support. Then you get into like this sense of awareness or knowledge. 28% say I don't really know how to do it. Others, I'm happy with what I'm doing. And then it gets down to other elements too. And this is all, on one hand, you think of consumers obfuscating or kicking the can down the road and say it's someone else's problem and it's not mine. And that, I think, if that's one way to interpret why people are saying it's not, I need more government, more business, more NGO support, and other people doing it. On the other hand, as we've thought about it and engaged consumers more deeply in some qualitative work, and for other clients, we can see that there is this need for a social infrastructure to bring people along. And in many ways, as individuals, we can interpret our acts as 1 in 8 billion people, and there's a rational actor model that suggests we're kind of all free riders. In the absence of clarity of how do we move forward, that the rational thing to do is to hang out. And you can see it why would I change my habits or my behaviors or go out of the way if it's a little bit more expensive or more inconvenient, in particular if my neighbor is burning stuff in his or her backyard and driving a tank instead of an EV. And why would I do it if my governments aren't signaling this is actually important and it's not a consistency in policy messages around it? And why would I do it if the brands that I support and buy from are also not consistently talking about sustainability in a way? And why would I do it if NGOs aren't all talking? So you can see the rational response we've had collectively of not flipping the switch and really diving into sustainability. And I think the answer in many ways is to come up with not only the irresistible products and services for people to glob onto, like an EV, electric vehicle that's better performing, maybe looks different, is more beautiful and designed differently than a traditional car, or also in the same token, plant-based food that's more interesting and more conversational and more exciting and dynamic compared to traditional meat, for example. Those are the two categories where we've seen the biggest movement. So the irresistibility is obvious. The other piece of it that drives, I think, behavior at scale is the inevitability, and the sense that if we can create the sense of this is the future and it's happening, you might as well get onto it, then I think people jump into behavior change. And the car is a great one. So if you're going to buy a car and you've had a traditional gas guzzling car, and now you're on the cusp, do I buy an electric vehicle, do I not? The signals I'm getting, my neighbor's got one, there's people down the road with them, there's a dealership, there's EV charging stations, there's incentives from governments. All of these signals hit a critical mass where it becomes this inevitability. And I think this is where consumers are telling us through this simple question that I need all this support. I need this social infrastructure to make me understand where the inevitable direction of travel is, as well as give me a really cool, exciting product. And so that's what this slide tells us. And we can see some differences here compared to some of the countries. So not enough government support, especially pronounced in China and India compared to the US. Also when it comes to being too expensive, the irony here is rich, where Americans and Canadians and other Europeans tend to point to expense and cost as being one of the bigger barriers compared to people in developing countries or emerging markets even. And there's a baked in perception, especially in the West, that sustainability is expensive. There's a brand appeal to that, but there's a view that it is expensive. In many ways, it is expensive on a category by category level. And then Chinese consumers are especially excited about business being more supportive to help enable their lifestyle change in many ways. So fascinating set of findings comparatively. And then just to showcase where the different markets reside when it comes to how do we express broadly as businesses sustainability. There are some cultural things where countries divide up, and in some ways on the issue of a verification society where it's clear and monitored and certified. This is where China and other parts of East Asia especially are connected. In a more affordability, market-driven, and a little bit of circularity, that's where the US and North America and European countries reside. And then when we think of where India is culturally and as a consumer expecting what businesses do, there's something more philosophical perhaps around fairness and this idea of how do companies act in the marketplace and drive it. So there's, just to showcase, there's a complexity here that's underneath the surface, which means we need to attend to very local culture and custom when it comes to consumption patterns and brands engaging consumers differently. Yet we saw the origin of this conversation was that there's a similarity on understanding these issues are big and they're increasingly important, but the manifestation of them in the marketplace become quite unique. So any thoughts or comments from you, Victoria, first on barriers and solutions?
Well, I'm now sort of going to contradict myself after what I said after the climate change section, which was that we're all broadly on the same page. It's the data, though, it's not me. I think that last slide that you just showed is particularly interesting, the groupings of the different countries that we looked at, because there was a very, very clear geographical grouping, and we grouped it by theme, not by geography. So I think the fact that those two things go hand in hand really show that we have to make sure that when we do look at solutions, we do need to take different markets and different geographies into consideration, because as much as everybody might have the same outlook in terms of what they want to achieve, the way in which they're going to achieve that is very different. And I think that speaks to the issues that they're closest to. So China, Hong Kong, I noticed, was very closest to the sort of transparency piece. Places like Vietnam and Thailand and India were closest to fairness, which might be to do with the fact that they have a lot of people sort of working in the supply chain, so they're much closer to that sort of ethics and human rights piece. Again, like you said, affordability, funnily, is the most economically developed nations, but again, that's forefront of mind. So I think it's very interesting to think about the fact that there are different barriers, there are different challenges in each of these places. So even if we're working towards a common goal, we really need to take a step back and say, what's going to work in each of these places? What language are we going to use? What solutions are we going to put in place? And can we tap into what consumers really want and what consumers expect to be able to actually take a couple of steps forward rather than sort of staying in this status quo, or, as we keep seeing, sort of sliding backwards and making a bit more of a mess.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Anoop, any thoughts to build on there?
Yeah, I think just one thing, one of the things that we did see regularly in barriers is the affordability. So the hope really is that the Gen Z, they're like really really want to lead like a healthy and sustainable lifestyle. So it's up to us to collectively ensure that this affordability barrier is kind of breached, because they can really change make this shift happen from this large madness of consumerism to a more respectable, sustainable lifestyle that all of us want to lead.
Yeah, and I think what's going to be fascinating in this study that we're about to embark on again will be how cost of living and that interaction, that hangover of sustainability being expensive really plays out because of the concerns for rising food and energy prices in particular. Wonderful. We'll just spend one more minute on this last very fascinating piece of insight that we came across, where we identified and asked people in the survey, do they belong to a self-reported minority ethnically, religiously, LGBTQ? And in China, there are about 10% of the population that self-report as being a minority in some capacity. In India, in the US, it's about a third of the countries self-report that way. And what was remarkable is that people who self-identify as a minority are much more affected and impacted by all of these issues, from the pandemic to the economy to climate change to air pollution to access to healthcare and to discrimination, as you'd expect. So that's kind of an expected sense of populations that are maybe more vulnerable or less part of the majoritarian view. And it's true in India, the US, and China, as well as other countries across the board. But what's remarkable and what was surprising is that minorities, as self-reported in all countries across the world, have a stronger desire to change their lifestyles more than the majoritarian population, and are actually doing more. So this notion of minorities being vulnerable might be true. They're impacted disproportionately by some of these environmental issues, but at the same time, they're more empowered to change lifestyles and are actually doing more. So it's a very different perspective on what maybe has been traditionally viewed when we look at different diverse populations in our countries. So I will stop there. I want to thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Anoop, very much for the fantastic color commentary and analysis from both of where the different regions of the world where you live in. And we are thrilled to have been a part of this. And I will pass it back to you, Anoop, because I know there's a wonderful next session that's going to focus on in India again, which is terrific. And wishing everyone a safe and good day ahead, and Slava Ukraini.